Hello, everyone. Good morning. I am so honored to be here, first of all, for your anniversary event, and also, I just love this community. I'm completely sold. This is it. I'm switching. Forget it. Forget robotics. I'm done. I'm coming over here because this is amazing. Let's see. One more plug, and we'll have it figured out. You know, my first job interview, I had to plug in a VCR. So some of us are on that age chart. That was the only part I didn't appreciate about the presentation, but everything else has been wonderful. So I promise that I will inform you and entertain you, and hopefully maybe you will learn a few things. But I don't want you to think that what you're hearing is by any means sort of typical of robotics. I somehow always find myself on the renegade end of any field. And so, you know, I think this is the whole point, is to kind of look at interactions among disciplines and sort of really push the bleeding edge of everything. So we are forming something together here. This is by no means the status quo in robotics. Having said that, I would love to project. Let's see. Maybe one click? Yes, there we are. Okay, so we live in very interesting times. This is not, in fact, a Chinese curse, as people may think. You could just look it up on Wikipedia, but not during my talk. But we do live in this really interesting time where there's a confluence of technologies that are, in some sense, you know, you can say going through a phase transition. People always feel that this is going on, but I think we can say we're going into people's lives and we're changing human behavior with the overall technologies that we're ourselves developing. And that is a big deal, and it's a big responsibility. And so as I go on in my talks, I find that one of the key things that I want to convey to people is the responsibility we have as well as the opportunity we have. And one of the big messages that I try to convey also is that we need more balance in our technologies. And that is not a job for someone else, that's a job for all of us. So as we create a lot of technologies, we're pushing towards automation. In my field in particular, so a lot of robotics, AI, machine learning is about automation, which, you know, many have argued is about replacement. We can get into a long argument about the future of work. Let's not, maybe after my talk. But there's this whole other area where technology can play a role, and that's augmentation or enhancement. And as I talk through the rest of my time here, I would like everyone to keep in mind this notion of what are you doing that is creating machines that are going to be helpful to us without replacing or taking over our social interactions and our work. Because the taking over is both of concern to people, and it should be of concern to all, because it does change how we actually exist as a humanity. So, about 15 years ago or so, we started this field of socially assistive robotics, and the idea is that instead of having robots do work for people, which is sort of the norm, right? They do the physical work, that's where the word robot comes from. Instead, we decided that we would look at how we can create machines that can help people help themselves. And this is very relevant to mobile technologies as well, right? Because with most things that aren't in the physical world, you really are helping someone think or act on their own. And so how can we do more of that? How can we help people through social, non-physical means? And it's very clear that we can do monitoring, that we can do coaching and training, you know, we can sort of collect information about people and we can give information to people. That's not hard. It turns out it's also not terribly effective, because people are really complicated, and to change our behavior, to change our drivers, it takes more than that. It takes internal motivation, and it takes social factors. And that's why I'm going to tell you a lot about this notion of how we drive human motivation and behavior through social interaction. But we are talking about technologies in the real world, physically interacting with people, which means it's really a convergence of a huge amount of different things that are not just robotics, as you will see, both interdisciplinary and intertechnology. And our driver, of course, is human health. I think that's a big enough driver. It's a huge societal challenge. In fact, I've had this slide. Whoa. I have had the slide. Now what happened? Is this one of these intelligence tests? I don't like it. Did it just go away for this one slide? All right. All right. Oh, really? Is it really the... Oh, there's a beautiful slide of really depressing health statistics. I have no idea why it's not coming up. They're very depressing statistics. Basically, the point is, The human health challenge is massive, and I'm sorry to say it's getting worse. And even though it's just the aging population, it's really across the age spectrum. Let me just pull one statistic at you, because you've got 50% of your attendance as students. We have about a 30+% rate of anxiety and depression among the students at K-12 and at the university level. So we're facing some massive health challenges, and they are just getting worse. And so we have spent the last 15 years deploying systems in all kinds of interesting environments. We've done short-term deployments, and then in the last few years, we've been doing long-term deployments. And that's really where, when I talk about the bleeding edge of technology deployment, you know, there is, well, it's hard work. It's hard work going into clinics, into homes of families with autism, into stroke patients, rehab centers, and staying there, and really staying with people. And so it's an incredibly motivating thing to do, and I want to tell you what it takes to motivate people who are having to deal with these challenges through our technologies. You know, all of our technologies, not just ours. So, in general, with human health, we could say, well, you know, people kind of know what to do, but they don't do it. We have all different levels of challenges, but it's not that we don't know what to do. And I think this is the first big mistake of a lot of technology. It's, we're going to tell people what to do. People don't know, we're gonna tell them, we're gonna buzz, we're gonna vibrate, we're gonna just, you know, give them a bunch of data, and that's gonna change everything. It's not. It's not information that people need. People need motivation and support, and that's a lot harder. So our goal is to do measurable behavior change. And our motivation for doing that right now is that we believe we finally have the technology intersection. We finally have enough, just enough, to get out there and do that for people. But the challenge is that you can do a lot of things on a short time scale. You can get people to adopt any technology, pretty much, unless it's really crappy, for a short amount of time. But to truly change behavior over a long period of time is very, very hard. This idea of, it used to be called compliance, now it's called adherence. It's a little bit more politically correct. But this idea of really changing is incredibly difficult. And so we're going to talk about how we can do behavioral models and personalize them to people. So how can we create technologies that affect human behavior through behavioral phenomena that are known from social science, cognitive science, and neuroscience? And then how do we personalize that through machine learning? So just a little tiny bit of psych, just so that, you know, I know everybody knows this, but it's a good reminder, right? What makes people behave? It's not data. No. What makes people change is habit and motivation. Okay, so habits are kind of fixed. We'll get to that for a moment, in a bit later, talk about technologies for habits. But motivation is the big one. And you have intrinsic motivation, things that drive you naturally, and you have extrinsic motivation. That's the pressures from the outside. It's very hard to manipulate human intrinsic motivation, so most things are extrinsic. So of all the things that you're experiencing throughout your days, the thing that has the most influence on your behavior are social factors. That's true for engineers, yes, it's true for everybody. We're incredibly driven, most moved, our needle is most moved by social influences. So that's where we want to impact our technology. We want to work through that. Now, what does that mean? Well, so first of all, it's really hard. When people talk about human behavior, until recently, it used to be the belief of everyone, including economists, all the way to people in machine learning, that human behavior is a rational function that you can approximate. Oh, let me disabuse you of that in case you're still holding that belief. Nothing about human behavior is a rational function that you can approximate, or anyone else. So that's been quite a disappointment. However, fortunately, there have even recently been Nobel Prizes in behavioral economics for precisely stating that. They went to psychologists who said, hey, human behavior, not rational. And moreover, it is not a stationary function. It changes over time, which makes learning kind of a pain, right? Because we can't approximate as effectively as we like to. But at the same time, this is really exciting, right? It's a really interesting problem. So people are moving targets in every possible way. And there's some interesting things people have done, right? We understand reward structures. All of our technologies are based on gamification reward structures, things that are sticky, things that we can't give up. But it's not clear that those things have been applied effectively to health behavior change. They're really great at hooking you to things, but it's not really clear that they're great for hooking you on things that you should be doing. They hook you on things that you shouldn't be doing, but not so much on things that you should. Now, things that do drive your behavior and do get you hooked are things that relate to these social interactions. And so we're going to talk about how can we translate that into technology. And it turns out for me as a roboticist, one thing that's been super useful that you might have less ability to leverage is embodiment. So the fact that we're embodied, you know, bags of flesh is important because we are driven by our internal embodied mechanisms. And it turns out that we physically interact with something, even just being present in the same room. We learn more, we remember better, and we're more positively affected than when we're interacting through a distance. And then if there's tactile interaction, even more so is true. That just is because of the way we're wired. And then the question is not that, well, we must have physical interactions in all things. It's just to understand that and to leverage that fact as we design technologies, whenever relevant and however possible. But having a body, you know, if you're a robot or if you're a human, having a body is complex. So just a little detour into robotics to entertain you and educate you a little bit if you haven't spent time in robotics. You know, robots have physical bodies, and that is hard. It's hard because they're physical systems, they have sensors, they have actuators, things break, etc. But more importantly, from the user perspective, everything about that body matters. The size, the shape, you know, if it emits sounds, what does it sound like? Proxemics, the use of social space, how you point, body language, affect, everything matters. We judge each other based on this, and we judge our machines based on this. And in robotics, we're just at the tiny beginnings of this. People are just starting to realize how complex it is to design robots that people actually want to use. In fact, there's already a graveyard of failed startups because of a variety of reasons of why people, you know, couldn't or wouldn't use those robots. Now, it's not as simple as just physical form, but physical form is incredibly more important than that as engineers we have realized up until now. So that's cool. It brings design into the field. It brings in this whole new area called UX, which is not well defined yet. It's not market research. It's really understanding what drives an interaction. And interactions are complex because they're dynamic. So I just want to show you just one, you might think of as a simple thing, which is the use of space. Proxemics is the science of the use of space. How far we are from each other, how much we gesticulate, how loudly we speak. It turns out to be incredibly important and incredibly subtle because no one taught you what to do. You just learned it by absorbing it in your daily interactions. And yet, if you need to teach a machine to do it, now suddenly you think, oh my goodness, there are endless rules, and how do I do this? And I can't really do it purely through ML because it's not going to try all kinds of things. I always say I encourage you to go into an elevator and go stand in the corner and face into the wall and just see how people respond. Lots of fun. So how might we make robots do this right? Well, here's an entire PhD dissertation a few years ago, a former student of mine, Ross Mead, on what it takes. Just a little, just to give you a sense.
In this work, we consider how the robot recognizes both speech and gestures in a face-to-face social interaction. The robot first imagines itself at thousands of different locations in a room. At each location, it predicts how loudly the person will speak and in what region of space the person will gesture. The robot then predicts how well it will automatically recognize speech and gestures and assigns a score to the location based on this prediction. Finally, the robot selects the location at which it predicts it will perform the best and moves to that location. Here, we see the robot predicts it will work well between 1.5 and 2.5 meters. The robot selects 1.7 meters as the optimal location to recognize human speech and gestures and moves there.
So, a lot of machine learning in the sense of training a lot of models based on human data in order to figure out where the robot should be. Now, of course, this is not very exciting. This is just sort of how it works for any given point. Of course, you really want to have the robot just move smoothly in response to the human. So this is what it looks like, and when you move smoothly, you really want to put music to it. So here we go. Oh my God, this is painful. Here we go. Some of us think that disco is still alive. Actually, it's coming back. So anyways, good movement with robot. Look how my student is enjoying it. This is people in my lab are happy. They're happy people. Look how happy they are. Ah, it's happiness all around. So, when done correctly, when social behavior is done correctly, it's like dancing. But when it's done badly, it's bullying.
Stop it. You look like you are about to kick me. Please don't kick people. It will physically hurt them. Stop it. Pointing and laughing at people is not appropriate. You should not do this because it is demeaning.
I don't know if you can tell, it's saying stop it. Pointing and laughing at people is rude.
Stop. You look like you are about to punch me. Punching is violent behavior.
Yes. So, the point is, how you move, how you behave is perceived by others, other social creatures, and therefore robots moving and behaving in a back and forth interaction are perceived, machines are perceiving us and we're perceiving machines. And this is fascinating for many reasons. First of all, I thought bullying was a great example because how do you train a system to detect bullying? Well, you think, well, we're just going to take a bunch of data on bullying. Well, you know, bullies don't love to be recorded. They tend to be more stealth about it, although less so these days. So it was a very interesting question of where do you even get the data to train the systems on subtle social behaviors? And that's a theme that I'm going to talk about throughout, which is that in the middle of this massive, or maybe at the beginning of this massive era of machine learning and big data, we're still extremely short of data for the kinds of interactions that we're interested in modeling. So when you think about human health, when you think about behavioral challenges, we don't have those data. And we're not going to get those data really, really soon because they're very difficult to get. So bullying is just a little example of how difficult that is. Now it's interesting also to find out that the more robots we have around us, the more people tend to bully them. So there's something about these machines that brings out not so great behavior in people. And that's an interesting issue as well. And this kind of gets to my earlier point, which is that as we're putting machines in our world, it's changing us. So we have to equip our robots not only to not be bullied, but to help us not bully others. All right, now I have to change. I'm going to just stay in this weird mode. Now having a body, right? Having a body is complex, and I'm going to move out of bodies in a minute, but I do want to say that everything we do stems from this embodiment. And sometimes having an embodied machine is necessary. And in particular, it's necessary when we're dealing with infants, because infants do not interact well with screens. And yet infants are so impressionable, they learn so quickly that that is the key time to change behavior. If a child is slightly behind for any reason, developmentally, in any particular way, the more time you miss, the farther the vector is from the typical behavior. And so catching that early is critical, but intervening in the early ages can only be done through human interaction or something that is very like human interaction. So we were interested in looking at early motor delay, and we wanted to expose infants to models of movement. Well, that can really not be done with anything other than a baby-sized robot. How convenient. So if you want a baby to start imitating something, a baby is going to look at a mother, ideally the baby's mother, or something that is like his or herself. And in this case, this is perfect, because if you put a screen in front of the baby will watch, there will be a bunch of saccades, but the baby cannot retain and cannot learn from it. Whereas if you put a physical machine in front of it, it can, which is fascinating and also useful. And so we did this whole study to show that infants actually can watch a robot kick and then learn to move their limbs accordingly, and therefore get motor practice, and therefore increase their likelihood on not having motor delay. So I just like showing videos of really chubby babies, so I'm just going to show you that. Branding. So basically we take these babies, some of whom have movement delays, and we have the robot demonstrate behavior. And that's motivating in itself. And then they eventually, after a couple of minutes, they explore just like robots. And eventually they start correlating their own kicks with the reward. They kick, the robot kicks. They don't kick, the robot doesn't kick. They learn. It's wonderful. They get happy. And then after a while, we do this thing to actually test whether it's working. We stop the robot from responding to the baby contingently. So then the baby has learned to kick, the baby kicks, the robot stops kicking. What do you think happens? The baby starts crying. We have proof that the baby has learned. Now this, wow, reinforcement learning in babies. Who knew? But it's really exciting for two reasons. One, because you really can't do this through a screen at that developmental age. And two, it's a powerful way to drive behavior, even in an instant. So remember, my overarching theme of this talk is how do we drive human behavior? And the answer is there's no fit answer. There's no fixed thing that you do and you'll drive behavior. It has to be adaptive. It has to be specific to each individual, their developmental stage and their context. So we'll hear more about that. But just remember the cute babies. And then it's interesting because there's some really interesting models, actually, mathematical models, in this case in particular by Laurent Ity and Pierre Baldi on modeling surprise. So it's a really nice Bayesian model of how can we predict surprise. And it turns out that surprise in infants is actually well modeled by this Bayesian model. Fantastic, right? So now we can predict where babies will look. Now we can drive where they should look, how the robot should move in order to attract their attention, in order to drive their behavior. This is quite a beautiful connection between a mathematical model and instantiated behavior in a robot driving human behavior. But what we find, to further my point, is that it's not extremely predictive across many different children. So again, we need personalized models. You can start with a specific model that's kind of a general Bayesian model, but you have to personalize it. And that is the other major theme of my talk. None of these things are one size fits all. And personalization is non-trivial, because now you need enough data, and now you need enough representative data. And we'll talk about why that's hard. Okay. Interacting with people is complex. I mentioned this earlier. I love it. This is why I'm in human-machine interaction, because I think people are so fascinating, and people through machine interactions are even more fascinating and unusual and unexpected because it's brand new. But it turns out that everything matters in a very complex way, and how we manipulate what we do with machines in order to engage humans and try to shape human behavior, it's completely uncharted territory. We're basically learning as we go. And we hope we don't make some bad mistakes also as we go. So, I can show this video. Now this video is several years old, and it's a motivating example from our work with stroke. So, one of the driving forces of rehab and in general coping with disability is the loss of function and social stigma at the same time. So, look at that sensor. Booming robots. All right, so imagine that you've suffered a stroke. That's happened to 1,800,000 people.
Hey, Connor, have you thought about your exercises? I bet you're feeling strong today.
Right, well, she's eating fiber, but she's not feeling strong. So how do we get people to do the behavior that they need to do, but they're not doing it, not because they don't know, they're not doing it because it's depressing and it's hard.
Hey, Connie, are you ready? I brought my workout clothes.
The robot does need to be buff, because it does need to appear like an authority on the matter. Because otherwise you will be like, I'm a cute, you don't know anything. So it has to be an authority. How does the robot dress itself? That's a separate research question. Let's not talk about that.
Seriously, we can do better than that. Connie, I might be a robot, but I'm not one.
What you can accomplish. So this is a critical thing. None of what you saw here would happen, and it won't happen twice, we'll just do it once. But none of what you saw here would happen if there hadn't been that social driver of a companion near Connie. Otherwise, on her own, she will just use the other arm to serve herself cereal, because why not? It's a much better way to go on with your life. You have a permanent disability, but no one's staring at you, no one can tell. Right? So really, when you think about people with serious challenges, what they're facing, the choice they're facing is, I have this limb that doesn't work, or whatever the challenge is, and I have to work really hard at it so much of my life, and be reminded every second of the day that there's something wrong with me. Well, that's pretty depressing, but that's the only chance to get better. Or I could just use my left, and people won't know, and I'll be disabled forever, which is also depressing. So it's like depressing or depressing. And I think that's what's lost on the majority of the population. So able-bodied people think that, oh, if I had a stroke, I'd just exercise and I'd get better. You'd think. Well, no. So these are some really profound challenges on human behavior and drivers for human behavior. And so we've studied this. We, for example, studied personality. Personality is a huge behavioral driver, right? You all know the people you like and people you don't like. We won't talk about who they are. But there are these personality things, like people of similar personalities do tend to get along. By the way, the stuff about opposites attracting, not true. Social studies have shown that that actually doesn't work. Maybe that has to do with 50% divorce and the myth that opposites attract. Let's just set that aside for the moment. But we did do studies in which we modeled personality, and people have now done this on disembodied agents, like virtual agents, and also physical robots. And it's interesting that if you embody an agent with personality, you can actually get users to spend more time with it, to learn more if it's a learning task, to sustain their behavior time on task longer, and to have better outcomes, both quantitative and qualitative. And then this becomes a question of, so how do we model personality? Well, that's a really interesting question, because there are all kinds of dimensions of personality, not all of which are appropriate to model. Like neuroticism, do we really want to model that? Is that appropriate for machines? As opposed to extroversion, introversion. And so we did some original work on modeling extroversion, introversion, and it's really interesting because it's a very quantifiable kind of set of properties, right? So you could tell if I'm extroverted by how much I talk, how much I move around, how much I gesticulate, how close I get to you, and also how high-pitched my voice is, regardless of gender. It's always slightly higher pitched for extroversion. And these are implicit traits. And so these are very quantitative. That means you can embody an interaction this way. You can embody your agent with these properties. And what you get out is that if it matches the user's properties, they will perform better on the task. So this has been completely quantified. It's, it's been repeated. It's kind of a powerful thing. But this does mean that you need a personalized technology, because there's no generic personality that works for everybody. We've also done some stuff on backstory. So backstory is very important. How do you motivate your agent to interact with a person? People don't want generic anonymous agents. It's interesting, actually, if you put robots in public spaces and they provide information, pretty soon if people have to interact with them for any time at all, they expect more. The same is true in manufacturing. If you look at the early work that's been done on putting robots on assembly lines, the workers on the assembly lines said, well, if that thing has to be there, I want it to tell me a joke. I want it to say hello. I want it to be funny. It makes sense. It's very human. But then you realize that you can't stop at just these kind of kiosk booth kind of robots. You really need them to be more like social agents. And to do that, they need some kind of a backstory. So what's an appropriate backstory? So we've done interesting studies looking at backstories in different contexts. We did one with exercise for obese teens who were at risk for type 2 diabetes, motivating them to exercise, because, by the way, if you're severely overweight, you think you should go to the gym. Well, it's not very fun to go to the gym when you're severely overweight and everyone else there is just showing off. So how do you, again, motivate this difficult behavior? Or, here's a really good one. We did this as part of an NSF expedition, and it was a really wonderful, wonderful opportunity to look at motivating child behavior and child learning. And one of the big challenges is, how do you teach kids to eat healthy food? It's the most boring thing ever if I start telling a kid, well, you should eat wheat bread instead of white bread because blah, blah, blah. So we had a robot do it, and the robot had a backstory. And we found that if we had a backstory for the robot that was in some way relatable to the child. In particular, we had the robot that we said, oh, my sister was in a race and she won last year, and now it's my turn to run or fly, whatever. It was a dragon, train your own dragon. But I don't know if I'm good enough, can you help me? And they got into this fun interaction, and the child would learn along the way, but of course it was all built in, so they didn't really realize. They weren't being just force-fed information. I just want to play you a little snippet on that.
Yum-tastic! Fiber One is the best one! Why do you think this is such a healthy cereal?
Because it's healthy for me and it makes me strong.
Yes, and it's healthy because it has fiber in it. Do you know what fiber is good for?
Who knows what fiber is good for? Okay, we'll just stop right there. But anyway, what we found, interestingly, is, of course, the more relatable the backstory, the more children and adults wanted to interact, and the more their behavior was changed. And also the more children retained about these really boring facts about white bread versus wheat bread and things like that. But there are quite a lot of things that robots can say or do that are highly unbelievable, and it's very subtle. right? And so it's very interesting because, for example, the robot on the left could tell the person that it came from another planet and gravity is different there and it needs to exercise, and that's okay. People will accept that. They don't really think the robot is from another planet, but that's okay. But they're just, okay, they'll roll with it. But if the robot says, oh yes, well, I used to be overweight one day, nobody believes that. And so why is that? Well, is it because it's a physical robot? Well, I mean, it comes from another planet. Which one is more believable? Or is it something about the weight that is so very personal to the user that you don't mess with those facts? And that's really what it boils down to. So doing these backstories is very subtle because it requires understanding the psychology of the people who are using the robot. It's kind of like screenplay writing. In fact, this is what we do in LA. We hire screenplay writers who are all unemployed. And they just write, they actually help us with developing these backstories because it's very subtle. And that's, again, this issue of behavior drivers, right? You have to understand the psychology, but then once you got it, now you can apply machine learning, and we had these robots get people to talk more and more and get more and more, you know, open about the interaction and learn and retain more. So that was interesting. Let me move on. All right, and we've done a lot of that with stroke as well. And there's some really interesting things that people had found with mobile technologies and with apps that we found also to be true with robots, which is not to be taken for granted. There are some things that transfer and some things that don't from embodied versus disembodied technologies. So for example, there are some really interesting apps that try to get you to do more exercise by giving you comparisons, like this is how well you did yesterday, you should do this much, or this is how well Bill did. Can you beat Bill, right? That kind of thing. And it turns out that if you think maybe intuitively that comparing people with others would be a great thing, but it's not for most people. For most people, it creates hesitancy and stress. And really the only messaging that works best is about how people feel. It's affect-related messaging. So messaging like, you know, if you do this, you will feel better. That turns out to work best compared to things like, you know, if you do this, you'll look better, or people will think you're smarter, or Bob will like you better, etc. And it's interesting that works with physically embodied artificial agents as well. All right, one more thing that we did. You know, my students sometimes think that it's not enough to have a human and a robot. Let's put a lot of humans in a robot, or a lot of robots in a human. In this case, a lot of humans in a robot. So this is a very interesting thing. Remember, I told you that machines can bring out really bad behavior in people. Turns out machines can also bring out really good behavior in people. And so we looked at this question of group mediation. So you get people together and they don't necessarily get along. If I were to get a bunch of you together to solve a problem, what we would get, well, maybe not here, this is a wonderful community. But you know, if I picked a bunch of random people together and had them solve a problem, we would get some pretty predictable dynamics related to human behavior, related to personality, etc. Some people would talk all the time, others would never say anything, some would be resentful, others would read their mail. It's very predictable. So how do you get a group to work together properly? And literally decades of research has been spent on this in terms of social science and getting improvement in group behavior in you know, organizations. So a student of mine, Elaine Short, now at Tufts, did a beautiful, beautiful dissertation where she said, let's think about moderating groups as a resource allocation problem. What are the resources? Well, the resource is who gets to talk. That's called the conversational floor. So the conversational floor is a resource, and maybe there's some other resources like the thing that you're holding that you want to pass around, whatever. So so you could do resource allocation as a, you know, well-known computational approach, but it's all about what are you trying to optimize. And so she did this beautiful setup with the robot sitting with groups of people, sometimes just college students, and sometimes intergenerational groups like grandchild, parent, and grandparent, and getting them to get along. And it was this very interesting thing because what she found was she validated social science theories without trying. She found that if the robot moderator optimizes how much everyone talks, and if everyone kind of gets a chance to talk, then it turns out the group becomes overall less selfish. They retain this ability to cooperate. So even when they take the robot away and then we bring them back the next week, they still get along better. And everyone reports being happier. But they're slower at getting the job done. Now, if you optimize for time, you just solve the problem. You know, doesn't matter, okay, that's great, that's not a good idea, let's go over here, right? So what you get is you get a faster solution, people are much less happy, they exhibit much more selfish behavior, and then as a group they don't get along. And this is the conundrum of group organizations, right? So now what's the value add of the robot? Well, the nice thing about the robot is that it's a moderator that isn't human, so people are willing to take its input, and they're not as upset when the robot tells them, oh, okay, well, thank you, you've said a lot, so how about it, let's hear it from her. And so it's an interesting thing, because we're finding that we can validate social behavior theories with machines as the interface, as the moderator. And to me, the most promising bit of this work really was that the robot can make a group of people become less selfish. So that's a powerful thing if you think about it, because usually we think about these technologies making people more selfish, right? Kind of bringing out the tribal side in us, self versus other. But here, you know, through the right kind of interaction, you can actually bring out the best in human nature. I think that's exciting when we think about technology development. All right, so learning, that's kind of the ultimate frontier. Everyone's talking about it. I told you that the premise of this work is that everything we do has to be personalized. There's no size fits all. And everything matters, every little thing. So, you know, what I say now, how it translates over time, your personality, your changes over time. I mean, it's an endless struggle. So let me just give you an example of several studies we did. So we had Children's Hospital of Los Angeles come up to us and ask us, could you use robots to decrease the experience of child pain? Which I thought was such a fabulous question. I mean, who doesn't want to decrease the experience of child pain? And so they said, well, you know, there's a study that shows if you take a robot and you have a child play with the robot when they're getting a flu shot, they experience less pain. Sure, that's a distraction. In fact, it doesn't have to be a robot. I'm pretty sure if I gave him something else, like the standard of care in medicine is distraction. You get an iPad when you go into an MRI scanner, you get an iPad when a child is getting an IV. But the problem is if they have a recurring condition, they're already afraid of the pain in advance, and then that causes anxiety. And so giving them a distraction is a very weak mechanism. It works for a flu shot, it doesn't work for more serious conditions. And so we got interested in coping and how we can model coping and different ways of learning what the child's coping mechanism is and then giving them that mechanism. And a group of colleagues of mine did this really beautiful study at LA Children's Hospital where they left these not particularly fancy robots in the hospital rooms, and they had to look like this because they couldn't have fur and they couldn't have anything that couldn't be washed off between patients, as you can imagine. So it had to be a 3D printed simple machine. But anyway, so we had this thing in the hospital for many months, and he was interacting with many different children, helping them to figure out what makes them least stressed. And the interesting thing that came out of this, these are a bunch of published studies, but just the high level point that I want to make is that the standard of care, which is distraction, actually comparatively caused children to experience more pain. So this is really interesting, right? It's not about distraction. If you bring a child in and they have a chronic condition, they know what's going on, and they know what they're afraid of. And so just shoving an iPad at them with Disney movies is just not enough. And this is this whole thing about understanding behavioral drivers. So we didn't try to distract them. We tried to do something more profound. We tried to get them to understand what works. Heavy breathing with the robot, or the robot will tell you what's going to happen. Because some kids like that. They want to see what's going to happen inside the arm with the needle. I was never that kid, but some kids do. It's interesting stuff. Now, let's just move a little bit towards the end, towards long-term studies. So everything I've told you so far has been single session or multiple sessions. Now, what we've been moving into is long-term studies. What happens, what does it take to design a machine that will work with you for months and years to help you with whatever your challenge is? And the first study that we're doing, we have pilot results and now we're continuing, is leaving robots in the homes of the elderly, getting them to be more physically active. Where physically active is a very simple and quantifiable thing. In one case, we don't want them to sit very long. So we just want them to, after they're sitting for a while, to get up. Because, you know, everyone sits too much, sitting is new smoking, etc. So how do you form habits? Habits are an amazing thing. Remember from my early slide, habits are a huge driver of behavior. Here's a secret about habits. Once you have a habit, it's never going away, ever. You can only mask it, but the way reinforcement learning works with your dopamine system, it doesn't go away. So this is why addictions are so difficult, because once you have a habit, you can't break it. But we're not working on that. We're not working on breaking habits. We're working on forming habits. So how do you form a habit? Well, you need a cue and a reward, and robots are great for that. The robot can be a cue for doing things because it's a social partner, and it can also be a reward. And so we've been doing things like leaving these robots in the home for weeks and months now, and looking at whether people, one, engage with the robot, talk with it, and whether it changes their behavior. And in the early results, what we find is that, okay, that's not a senior, that's my student. I just want to make sure no one thinks that we're working with some really young 65-year-olds. We can't actually show images of our participants. But the interesting thing we find is that when we put these robots in people's homes, they most definitely change people's behaviors. People do what the robot tells them to do, even over a period of weeks and weeks. And we have the robots telling them jokes, and these are just like dad jokes from the web. And they love it. It's great because it's just the same way that people love their Alexas, right? It's something unexpected. It's there for you every day. As long as you don't get bored, it does something. But as soon as we take the robot out, because we have to eventually, you know, we don't have thousands of them, or hundreds, or even dozens, they go back to their earlier behavior. So you've set up a whole scaffold system, but you haven't really formed a habit. Because if you formed the habit, if you take things away, the habit would persist. Well, it doesn't. So we really set up a social support structure, which is a good thing, but it does depend on having the technology always present. And I think this is important because a lot of these apps that people come up with that say that they will change behavior, as long as the person is willing to use the app, maybe, but people stop very quickly in most cases. So really, how do you get at the underlying drivers? And for us, the robot is a social companion, so people want to keep interacting with it, right? That doesn't get old, or it has to be designed so it doesn't get old. It has to have the right personality, it has to have the right backstory, so that they keep wanting to interact with it. And ultimately, it has to keep adapting. It has to keep doing that machine learning to adapt its personality a little bit, its backstory a little bit, so it continues to be interesting and engaging. And this works, by the way, all the way to Alzheimer's patients. We've done a study with Alzheimer's patients for 6 months. We had Alzheimer's patients interacting with the robot in really simple ways. It was just here.
Sing it together.
It's just singing for them. All right, we'll just stop right there because the singing is beautiful. Why is it not beautiful? Well, you know, you could put Frank Sinatra on the robot, and we have. And you put Frank Sinatra on the robot, and you bring it to an elder care home with stage 2 Alzheimer's people who do not recognize their family, but they say, that's not Frank, right? Because now that is the very notion of the uncanny valley, which is a fabulous idea that was never actually quantified, but it is a very real phenomenon, which is that when there's a cognitive dissonance and disparity between your expectations of what the robot promises and what it can deliver, you are quite upset. And so, you know, if it sings like Frank Sinatra, but it isn't Frank Sinatra, that's creepy. If it, for example, in our case, if the robot moves all of its body parts but not the neck, why is it not moving the neck? People immediately notice. If it doesn't move anything, that's okay. But if it starts moving things, oh, it better move all the things. So we are wired to expect a lot of complex social cues. And if you get even a little bit wrong in your design, it's very salient to people, and it can cause this uncanny valley. And so people really fall into the uncanny valley when they build very highly realistic machines. Whether it's, and you know, we see this now with deep fakes, where if it's good enough, it's fine. But like recently, I saw this deep fake of Elon Musk. And, you know, the eyes didn't move enough. It was immediately obvious. I mean, who's fooled by this? I guess a lot of people, but, you know, it's this interesting thing about what is salient to us and what we expect. In physical interactions with robots, the things that aren't real are much more salient because we're wired for these physical interactions. When it's on a screen, you have kind of a layer of indirection, so you can fool people a bit more easily, as has been seen. I could show you math, but you'll be bored. But there's some nice, in case people are interested, there's some really nice algorithms out there that have been very effective for learning and adaptation, Bayesian knowledge tracing, blah, blah, blah. Okay, I want to tell you about one more domain that we have invested a lot in over the last 15 years, and that's autism. When I talk to students about what they should be working on, I often try to get them to understand that the world is full of major, massive challenges that are just getting bigger, that we should not be ignoring. This is not going away. Something is happening to make this worse. I don't know what, but you know, autism is continually on the rise. And it's now anywhere between 1 in 45 and 1 in 68 children in the US that are diagnosed. And it's, you know, it's a spectrum, and it's a really fascinating scientific challenge in addition to being just a gut-wrenching societal challenge. But the really interesting thing about autism that challenges us both in health and in technology is that there's no such thing as big data because every child is a unique constellation of symptoms and symptom severities. Every individual, in fact, not just every child. So that makes learning very difficult because one, you don't have big data, and even if you did, the variance is so huge that your data are pretty useless. So we have spent a lot of time now with the support of the National Science Foundation going into homes of, a dozen and more children and staying for over a month and collecting their interaction data in order to see just how much machine learning would actually work on such a messy, messy kind of data. I just want to show you a little bit of what that looks like. Too many button presses.
Meet Adrian, age 6,
This is some great work.
and his robot friend, Kiwi.
You are doing an amazing job.
On this weekend morning, they've settled in to play some games, along with Big Brother Darren. Adrian is on the autism spectrum, and Kiwi is no toy. It's a socially assistive robot.
You are doing really great. Keep up the good work.
Social assistive robotics is a new field.
Boring. Bad video, no. Okay, blah, blah, blah. That's not important. And this is a great video that's on the web, by the way, Science Nation. We were very honored that NSF came in and captured this. But the point that I want to convey is this. Okay, you look at the robot, it's not a very complex robot. Although, let me tell you, the system integration challenge in putting a robot in the home for a month, well, no big company is doing that yet. I wish they would. Okay, so, but our lab could do it. And when I say our lab, it's also colleagues as well. So that's really important. You need the robot to motivate the child. The tablet alone is not going to do it, or it will do it, but it won't do it in a way that's really teaching them the right skill. So now you have this integration of technologies. You need an embodied agent like a robot. You need a lot of content educationally, which comes from the tablet, because it's difficult for the robot to teach math with its embodiment, right? And then most fundamentally, you need the social scaffolding of either the family or the robot or both. And this is really an interaction of technologies, right? We have a camera somewhere that's capturing everything on the child. You could put the camera on the robot, but then the robot moves. So then the camera moves. So then vision goes out the window. So these are some real complex system integration issues. We have perception. We have multimodal data. We're trying to understand the child's behavior in real time and respond. And I'll show you a nice video of that. And then we collect a ton of data. And yes, there's a lot of math. A big paper came out recently in Frontiers on this. So I won't bore you. There's data, in case you're worried about whether there's data. There's data, there's math. The most important thing is, are we using deep learning? Everybody wants to know, are you using deep learning? All the students come into my lab, they just want to do deep learning. And my question to them is, where are you going to get data for deep learning? Do you know how much data it would take? That's a mathematical question. How much data do you need to do some interesting deep learning on, for example, kids with autism? Deep silence, very deep. Well, because people don't really understand what they're doing here. They're just like, oh, we're all about deep learning. Okay, machine learning is a tool. It is not an end in itself, it is a tool. And to apply a tool, you really need to understand the problem. And the really interesting thing about many behavioral problems is that it is not about having a big data set. In fact, you either don't have the data set or the data set has incredible variance. So now what? So how do we personalize? People are just starting to scratch the surface, but ultimately there's very, very little work on the really hard problems, on the truly multimodal problems. Let me give you an example of a multimodal problem. This is a 3-year-old with a cognitive disability being taught by a robot and a tablet to sequence and to count. This is amazing. And this is a PhD student's work. Caitlin Claybaugh.
Count them out loud.
So,
1,
child speaks, makes eye contact. The robot responds. The game moves.
2, 3, 4, 5, 5.
Everything has to be just so. If the child doesn't move the right piece, the robot will not give praise. If the child doesn't look, the robot won't give praise. When the robot gives praise, the game moves along. This is not just like, oh, anything happens. I mean, this is a real social dynamic. And we need more of that. But for that to work, there's audio data, there's video data, there's tablet data. It's all in real time. And we need a lot more of that. We need complex scenarios like this. Okay, not everybody has to work with 3-year-olds. That really takes, takes a lot. But we need a lot of multimodal data in real life scenarios, and that isn't happening enough. In my field, I suspect in any field. And that's because we have some practical barriers. This kind of research is really slow. You start with human subjects and it just goes on, right? You got to get IRB, you got to do interdisciplinary partners so that you're not dabbling. It's really hard to get data. And guess what? Once you get these data, then you have to annotate it because we don't yet have really good machine vision algorithms that will take really complex data and annotate things like, is the child engaged? Oh, sure, there are lots of packages out there, but you know, their success rate is about 15–20%. So we still have humans watching videos for hours on end and annotating them. That is the state of the art. That's where your big data come from. And then once you do that, you only have features, and that's the most you can share. So it's very difficult to do data sharing as well. And so there are not enough incentives for people to do this kind of work. So there are not enough data sets out there. Most things are single modality or very simple, you know, double modality, like maybe there's audio and video, but you know, very limited. So that's unfortunate because this is what we need a lot more of. We need more multimodal, complex human data and algorithms that can deal with such data and the development of both in parallel. So that's what we lack, and that's a huge barrier to all of our fields. But once we get there, then we can do some really well-designed human-robot interaction and human-machine interaction more generally. So this is not just HRI, this is really HMI. And the well-designed bit is hard. We don't know yet how to design really good HMI. So this is an open field that's going to take a lot of data and a lot of work. But as a result, we can have some really amazing outcomes. And so I will stop there and thank my students and sponsors, and thank you for inviting me.